Hi, everyone. My name is Virginia Duan, also known as Mandarin Mama, and I'm really excited to be here at the Hivery to talk about how to use vulnerable stories to transform your writing. Uh, just a little bit about me. I write at my blog called mandarinmama.com, and I'm a podcaster with the Nuna Army podcast. I'm a digital content creator and a freelance writer for sites like Scary Mommy, Romper, Mom.com, and Healthline. I'm the entertainment editor at Mochi Magazine, which is the longest running online publication for Asian American women and non-binary folks. And I'm the founder of Brazen Asian, which is an intimate series for Asian Pacific Islander and Desi American creatives and influencers. And last but not least, this is my favorite band in the whole entire world, K-pop band BTS, and I'm a huge fan. So that's actually very important to know about me because everything in my life revolves around BTS. All right. So the three things we're going to learn today are like, what does it mean to be vulnerable? How to generate compelling content by telling your story, and then specific and actionable steps you can take to liberate your voice. So what does it mean to be vulnerable, and why does it elevate your writing? When we talk about vulnerability, I think a lot of us think that we're talking about, digging deep and pulling out all the trauma and like pain and suffering and like the worst parts of yourself to show people. I think some people think of vulnerability as like laying themselves naked and having people just like pick at it and like criticize it. And while that can be part of vulnerability, ultimately, vulnerability is just sharing a part of yourself with others. It can be pain, fear, shame, joy, and as simple as your dreams. I'm going to be using examples from my own writing to talk about how to use vulnerability in your stories. So I'll just go through each of these points and use some of my stories of how I've used them in writing to be vulnerable, and then kind of how it made me feel. Now, I will caveat with the point that I am actually pretty shameless in the sense that things that seem brave to other people don't feel that like awkward to me. So I have no problems. It's not difficult for me to share like deep, painful things. It's a little bit more difficult for me to share about my dreams and my hopes because, as we will discuss, those can be very vulnerable as well. So I'm going to break down each of these things that you can share and use my own stories as examples that I've shared in my writing or have shared in talks with other people. So the first one is pain. I think this is the one that most people think of when we talk about vulnerability, either childhood trauma or, pain and suffering and all these things, physical pain, any type of pain. And I think that's usually what we go to in vulnerability, because when we think of being vulnerable, we think of other people having a means to hurt us. Because of that, it's probably the easiest one to go to in the terms of like telling your story. Not easy in terms of like emotional labor, but easy as in you probably can think of many examples of pain in your life that can be shared or are pertinent in a story. So for instance, I had a very abusive childhood, and I do talk about it in my writing. I share stories about my father abandoning us, being abusive physically, and just the ways that has warped my understanding of love and how to break that cycle with my own children. Another way I've been vulnerable in sharing pain is that in this last year, yes, a lot of us have had a very hard year because of the pandemic, but I am more speaking specifically of the rise in anti-Asian violence and racism. That has been very difficult on Asian Americans and Asian women in particular, especially because in the past few weeks of the Atlanta shootings, of which 8 people died and 6 of them were Asian women. And that I have been writing a lot about, and it has been very vulnerable to share about anti-Asian racism has affected me personally and how it has uh, it's just made me really tired. It's been very difficult for me to write. Uh, it's been very difficult for me to even, get my shit together to get this talk together. In the past few weeks, uh, a lot of horrible things have happened. And part of me feels like when I share this story, it sounds like an excuse. It sounds like I'm using this pain to justify me like blowing deadlines or not doing a good job for things. Um, but it's also true. It's a part of my story. And so I share it so that other people who have felt the same pain can feel safe to know that they can also share this pain, but also that they can connect to this pain or that they're not alone. It's actually been a really, really rough several weeks because of specifically anti Asian racism. But also, this past week, I found out my friend died in a car accident. She had children. She's the reason why I'm friends with some of my very best friends. And she set in motion a lot of life changing things for me. And she has 2 kids and she's gone. And I wasn't really close with her, but I have been crying on and off every day since I found out. On top of that, there's this general anti-Asian racism, which has been, especially the Atlanta shootings, which, because I'm a freelance writer and I write for several publications, and I'm one of the few, if not only, Asian American women writers on staff. I've written like upwards of 6 to 7 anti-Asian racism or violence articles. And some of them are op-eds, some of them are just facts. And I didn't think it would hurt me as much as it has, but it has. And then we add on the fact that we're talking about pain here, right? So I'm giving you all sorts of pain. I'm sharing all sorts of pain in this sense. And then right after I found out about my friend's accident, my hip went out. It hurts. I think as women, have very high pain tolerances. And so I rarely ever go to the doctor. I rarely ever go to the ER. I just grin and bear it. But it got to my husband has never seen me in so much pain. And so I had to go to the ER because I felt like my hip went out, it was out of socket. So all this, and I'm super behind on deadlines. I'm super behind. was super behind on getting this talk together, all these things compounding on each other. And then I still feel just crushed by all of this like pain. And I'm sharing this in my writing, and I share this with you in this talk, not to make you feel sorry for me, not to make you feel bad, but I share it because it is a part of myself. And as a writer, my job is to write truth and to communicate truth. And part of that truth is pain. I write a lot about anti-Asian racism. I write a lot about justice and social justice. And I write a lot about just me, right? And part of that is sharing the pain of being Asian American, of being an Asian American woman, the pain of living in America, in a country that was founded on genocide and patriarchy and white supremacy. That is what I bring to my writing. That is a conscious and almost unconscious way that I share myself with people. It is not for everybody, and I'm not saying you should or shouldn't do that, but that is how I write, and that's my own pain and suffering. So that is one way you can include pain. As I said, it is what most of us probably think as the most vulnerable. Another part that you can share of yourself is fears. So I share a lot about my fears of turning into a monster, just like my father. I share about my fears of when I'm fighting white supremacy. I don't want to turn into a hateful person. I don't want to turn into a monster. That is actually one of my greatest fears, to turn into a monster, to turn into the type of monster as I'm fighting all these other monsters. And so I share about that. Um, I share about like the fears of getting what I want, fears of just everyone has fears, right? That's something that's very um, understandable and relatable. So you can share stories of fear. You can share stories of shame. I really like Brene Brown and how she talks about how shame, the slayer of shame is empathy. And when we share the things, our stories that we think that makes us unlovable, um, and then we are met with empathy, that then we are healed. And so I share a lot of stories that other people would normally shy away from. For instance, I try to live my life as shamelessly as possible because shame silences us. And I am sick of being silenced as a woman, as an Asian American woman, as a person who grew up in the Christian religion and background. And so I feel like shame is a huge thing that people use to crush us and to silence us. And so part of sharing yourself can be to share things that are shameful and then to break the silence around it. I share often about sex, the things I think about sex, whether like actively, you know, I shared about BTS before, like being a lot of people are older fans of BTS sometimes feel shame because they feel like, oh, boy bands are for kids or for teenagers, for young people. But I try to always share about BTS as much as possible because I don't want to feel shame about something that I love. I talk about, masturbation. I talk about I share these stories in my writing, much to the chagrin of my husband, perhaps my children when they're old enough to like read my work. I don't know how I feel about them reading my work, but that's all good. Uh, but also funny things like anal leakage. How one day I was just minding my own business in bed. I didn't even fart. And then I felt something leak out of my butt. And I was like, ah, did I just leak shit out of my ass? And the answer was yes, I did. And it was in front of my children. They laughed at me. I felt incredibly embarrassed. And then I also had to change the sheets, which was really annoying because I hate changing sheets. But I changed them because there was actual poop on my sheets. And I felt such like immense, like, oh God. And that I, of course, immediately went to social media and shared it on Twitter, shared it with all my friends. I shared it on Clubhouse with people. I shared it with Margaret Cho, the actress and comedian, because she happened to be in a room and I was asking her questions about like how to convert trauma into like content without it harming us. And that is how I combat shame by sharing it with everybody. And so that's one way you can include stories. It doesn't have to be as like drastic as poop. But once I shared it, so many people told me their own poop in their pants stories. And we bonded over that, right? Another thing that people don't realize is vulnerable is sharing joy, things that make you happy. Because what if, how there's people who just kind of like to yuck your yum. People who are always like, oh, well, that's not that great. Like the Debbie Downers of the group, right? So it is actually very vulnerable to share the things that bring you joy because there's always got to be somebody who's going to say, oh, well, did you know that that's problematic? Or, oh, it's actually not that great. Or they'll say, oh, you like this? Well, this is why that sucks, right? So it's actually very vulnerable to share about things that bring you joy. And also dreams, which I kind of put into the same category as joy. It is very vulnerable to share our dreams because when we share them, people can immediately say, oh, well, that's a dumb dream. So one of my biggest dreams is to be famous. And I often, soften it with a joke because I feel like kind of I feel very vulnerable when I share my dreams about wanting to be famous. Uh, all I can think of are people, are detractors saying, like, well, who do you think you are to be famous? Who do you think you are that you can, interview BTS, which is another one of my dreams. For me personally, it's difficult to share about my dreams or my joys. For others, for you, it might be very difficult for you to share things that you're afraid of or your pain or your shame. And it might be really easy for you to share your joys. There's lots of ways to be vulnerable. These are just five that I have found in my writing. So, why does vulnerability elevate your writing? Well, I mean, here are my five bullet points, right? It's memorable. You can form a deep connection with people. It anchors your points to like a story. And it makes you human, and it's powerful. Why does vulnerability elevate your writing? It's because it's memorable. How many talks have you attended where someone told you that shit leaked out of their ass? Probably this one, right? Like, probably very few, you know? And so that type of vulnerability can be memorable in a good way, bad way, who knows? But it's memorable, right? Or, and it forges deep connections with people. Whenever I write about something that's deeply vulnerable, like being estranged from a parent, um, or the poop story, people always remember. And then they write in, they comment, they say like, "Hey," and it's like an instant connection because people don't normally talk about vulnerable things, right? And so when you are vulnerable, it's an intimacy that you're sharing with people, and so it forges a deep connection. And when you share it in your writing, and especially uh, writing can reach a lot of people, right? And so they feel a deep connection with you, like they know you, and it can anchor a point. Your vulnerability can be an anchor for a key point you're trying to illustrate. And hopefully that's what I was trying to do with the previous slide when sharing about my pain, fears, and shame, and joys and dreams. That you can use these stories to like illustrate and anchor key points in your writing. And it's human. We're human, and so we want to connect with people who are real. Why is there such a backlash against like Instagram influencers? It's because it seems inhuman, right? Like they have their perfect houses, they have their perfect families, their perfectly photogenic children, and like animals and foods. I can't take a good picture of food to save my life. But it makes us human, and it makes you human, and it reminds people of their humanity. And because of all these things in conjunction, it makes your writing powerful. Your vulnerability becomes a strength because it is so hard to be vulnerable. People recognize that it takes bravery or courage to deep part of you, whether it is a dream, a joy, a fear, a shame, or a pain. It is from this vulnerability that makes your writing powerful. And I bring it again to BTS. A huge reason why their fans love them is because they are constantly vulnerable. They are not afraid to be vulnerable in their art, but they're also not afraid to be vulnerable. This is at an award ceremony after a really tough year for them, and they just wept on stage, and they're not afraid to show their pain or their joys to their audience. And in fact, that's what endears them and what makes us as fans more. All right. So how can you generate compelling content by telling your story and why that is irresistible to your readers? So my approach is I always try to think of who, what, where, why, when, and how. That's kind of what they teach you at the very beginning when you're like a kid and learning how to write. But that's very important. Who is my audience? What are they trying to learn? Where is this? Where is this story located? Is my audience? Are they in the US? Are they in the suburbs? What? Why am I telling this story? When is the story located? And then how am I going to tell the story? Am I going to tell it with like flashbacks? Am I going to tell it as an aside comment? Am I going to tell it in an interview? How? Right. So these are all things that as a writer, they're all tools in your writer toolkit, right? And then you can make use of that. Is it a review? Am I writing a review of of a movie, of an entertainment piece? Is it is it a story? Like, is it a fictional story? Like, how can you use your personal vulnerable moments and put it in a fictional story to make it more real? Is it a profile of someone, or is it an opinion piece? And I feel like some of these, sometimes it's easier said than done to put your vulnerable stories into it, depending on what type of piece it is, but it can be snuck in, all right? It can inform the questions that you ask someone. It can inform the questions you ask the audience. It can inform the questions you ask yourself. I write what I know, right? And that's what they always say, like, write what you know. And what I know is I know my stories. I know that they're worth hearing. And I know from experience that if I share my stories, other people will connect better. And I write the way I talk. Sometimes when we tell a story, we try to write it in a way that is like really smart sounding. And I'm not saying you're not smart or that I'm not smart, but I write in a way that is not us, but write in the way you talk, write in the way you know how to be, and it will come out of you. Your story will come out of you. And my last part is just to be myself, which is actually what, write what I know, write the way I talk. That all comes from being myself. When you're telling a vulnerable story, you have to have it be from you and from who you are, because that's the definition of being vulnerable, right? Is to show who you are. And you can't be vulnerable without being who you are. And the reason why it's irresistible is because people love tea. They love the tea. They love drama. People love drama. People love knowing like secrets, right? Like, isn't this why we like why we watch like behind the scenes, why we watch reality TV? Because we think it's like real. That's why it's irresistible. And so the more you give of yourself in your writing, the more you share of yourself in your writing, the more people will be irresistibly compelled to read your stuff, because they know when they read your writing, you're going to share true parts of yourself. You're going to tell things as they are, or you're going to be real. And that's what people want. That's what tea is, right? They want the unvarnished parts. They want the un-Instagram version of you, or the parts of the story. They want the ugly, meaty parts. And that's what makes it irresistible to readers. How to liberate your voice and specific and actionable steps. Like, it's really easy to hear someone say like, oh, be vulnerable, tell your story and blah, 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 blah. But like for some of us, it's difficult to be vulnerable. It's difficult to talk about ourselves. It's difficult to get out of that weight of shame that society has put upon us for all our lives, right? Especially for women, especially if we are part of a marginalized community. We have been told our whole life to be quiet. So it can be very difficult to be vulnerable, especially in our writing. So here are some actionable steps. Start small. If it's easier for you to share joys, share your joys. If it's easier for you to share your dreams, share your dreams. And then just start. It doesn't have to be like your deepest trauma, right? It doesn't ever have to be your deepest trauma. It just start small. Do you have cramps today? Like, do you have aches in your body? Like, my hip hurts really bad right now. But like, so it could be that be a small thing to share. And the more you start sharing small things, the more you see how people have not like cast you out for sharing small things, small vulnerabilities, the more you'll see that they will also accept you if you share big ones. And they might actually love you more because of it. And if they don't, to remember that not everyone is for everybody. I am not for everybody. My style is not for everybody. But for the people that I am a good fit for, then that's it for them, right? Like, I'm their person. Ask yourself, what's the worst that can happen? For me, what was the worst that could happen? The worst actually did happen. Because I write so much about like anti-Asian racism, about white supremacy, I got doxxed. at the end of last year around Thanksgiving, I got doxxed by a white nationalist forum. They posted my personal address and information on a white nationalist forum, and with the intent to cause me harm, right? And it was terrifying. I was like stunned and shocked, and then I couldn't stop crying. I was getting death threats and rape threats like constantly in my email, through LinkedIn. Can you imagine? LinkedIn, that's like linked to your job and stuff. LinkedIn, through Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, anything, YouTube, anything, and you can name any social media, any way to contact a person. I was contacted that way. I had to file a police report. I shut down all my socials. There were at least 2 YouTube videos made of me to mock me, shame me, talk about how ugly I was, how my children are ugly, how I'm a horrible person, how I'm a waste of space, and then all these horrible things that I would never wish upon my worst enemy to say to them. That to me was the worst that could happen. And I thought for sure I was going to be fired, all these things. And it happened. And I'm still here. And so just what's the worst that could happen? Generally, it probably won't be that drastic. I also asked myself, who said I couldn't talk like this? Who said I couldn't be this way? And because I am sort of a rebellious person, I hate being told what to do. I identify those voices, and I'm because I'm petty. I say, I don't care who said that. They can't control me. When you identify the voices, you might realize that those voices don't mean anything to you anymore, and they are not important to you anymore. Or if they are, maybe what your story, your vulnerability is more important. That maybe you've gotten to the point where what you say is more important than what other people say. Next is practice. You just have to practice. This is one of those things where you can only learn by doing. You cannot learn how to write vulnerably without writing vulnerably. It is in the doing that you become more and more vulnerable. It is in the doing that you become vulnerable, and it is in the doing that you become better at it. And then last is to set boundaries. A lot of people think that I share everything there is to know about me on the internet, but that's not true. I talk about sex, for instance, but I never talk about sex with my husband. Not because we don't have any, but because that is also his story. And he doesn't want his life on blast, even though I don't mind, right? But he minds. So I don't talk about that. I don't use my children's real names. And now that my kids are older, I make sure I get their consent before I share a story or before I share a picture. So there's certain boundaries that you want to set for yourself, that just because you are vulnerable doesn't mean that anyone gets access to you, that anyone gets access to your stories. I have set certain boundaries about where and how I use my pain about anti-Asian racism, or like being a woman, or misogyny, or like where I make sure that it is with places that I think are safe, that aren't going to use me, that aren't going to use my pain for their pleasure or their entertainment, that it is mine to use and wield how I deem comfortable and safe. So there's lots of boundaries. Just because you're vulnerable doesn't mean anyone has access to you. And finally, there's no actual point to the slide. I just wanted to look at them. So here's how you can find me. I'm at the Mandarin Mama on Twitter and Instagram. On Facebook and YouTube, I'm Mandarin Mama. You can find me at mandarinmama.com, and you can email me any questions you have, Virginia at mandarinmama.com. Thank you so much for watching. I had a really great time, and I hope you learned something. And if there's any questions you have, please email me or contact me. Have a wonderful day.